Welcome. I'm Dimitri Gallo. Welcome to the D'Annunzio Institute of Philosophy's second annual seminar in social and political philosophy. It's going to be given this year by Professor Kevin Vallier. So a few notes before we get started. Firstly, the event's being recorded, so it might show up online at some point, so be aware of that if you want to close your video. So the talk is going to go on for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have about an hour for a Q&A. If you have a question that you want to ask during the Q&A, just message me directly and I'll add you to the queue. It's the custom here at Australian Catholic University to start talks like this with an acknowledgement of country. We commence our meeting by acknowledging the first peoples and traditional custodians of the country where D'Annunzio is located, the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge their elders past and present, and remember that they have passed on their wisdom to us in various ways. Let us hold this in trust as we work together and serve our communities. So now let me introduce our speaker. Professor Vallier is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University. He's the author of numerous articles on religion, liberalism, social trust, social contractualist theories of ethics, in addition to 5 books, most recently, Trust in a Polarized Age. Today, he's going to be making the case against Catholic integralism. So join me in giving him a warm, if virtual, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to do 45 minutes, but it takes a bit of time to situate these issues. So I'll just sort of begin, because this really is an attempt to do political theology with analytic tools. And so oftentimes it requires some background. But thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks for hosting me. It's good to try out these ideas because this is pretty out there, folks. So it'd be good to get your thoughts. Okay, so let me see when we get started. So one of the things that we're seeing, and we're really seeing this in different countries where younger generations are kind of interested in a religiously infused politics again. I think this is partly due to the demise of Marxist, not democratic, but Marxist socialism, and certain kinds of secular socialist governments like in India and Turkey. And so I think, you're seeing younger people of faith, not necessarily more, but people, but the same folks are interested in this religiously infused politics. I think it's true. I think India is actually a really shocking example. But many of the people who have these questions are Christians. And we've seen questions coming up from younger Catholics, Poland, Hungary, a bit in France, a little bit in England, and the United States, a number of other places. And the general worry is that there's something sort of gone wrong with this idea that we can have a regime that's based on the equality and freedom of everyone, and that the consequence of equality and freedom is that the state should not take sides on matters of reasonable disputes about values or something roughly like that. I can talk about it, but I think the sense is that this is a lie. This is a trick. And that what we really ought to be doing is what liberals are in fact doing, which is institutionalizing the whole truth, whole moral and political truth about politics. And so I'm writing a book now, All the Kingdoms of the World, that's coming out next year, where I look at a number of what I call religious anti-liberalisms. And I'm focused on Catholic integralism, as I'll talk about today. But I think there are really interesting structural analogies with some Chinese Confucian thought and Sunni Islamic political theology. So I talk about them as well. So what I want to do is look at one of the sort of proposed radical alternatives to liberalism, because there's a lot of people that are against liberalism that are just kind of complaining, right? They don't really have an alternative. And their complaints in many cases are reasonable. I don't mean to dismiss them. It's just, maybe we should have like more immigration restrictions, or they'll propose or something. But there are people out there proposing really, really different views. And so I just thought, look, let's look at one of them that was around for a long time. So this doctrine, now called Catholic integralism, it's gone under different names, is this kind of hot and new, but in other ways kind of quite old alternative to liberal order. And in some nations, Catholic nations, it's in many ways a precursor ideology. So you might think of France in this way, or maybe although you have to adjust for Gallicanism, sorry, I just avoid asides to get through everything. All these qualifications that you may want to push me on in questions, I'll just let you do that. So what I'm going to do is define integralism. I'm going to raise a problem for it. And the justice argument claims that an integralist regime permits unjust coercion of the baptized. So that's my thesis. Integralism's false because it permits the unjust coercion of the baptized. Now, we're not doing kind of modern analytic political philosophy and just modern political philosophy in general. Particularly starting with Hobbes, when you start to read early modern political thought, this theory is really about the state and the individual, the state and the citizen, and perhaps if they're better, there's like the state and intermediary institutions and the citizen. But there's only one polity that any one person is a member of. Now, so you might have dual citizenship or something like that between Scotland and France or something like that, right? But really what we're theorizing about is the state as the polity. But for much of the Catholic Church's history, the church would oftentimes present herself as a polity. And this wasn't merely because the Pope was an Italian sovereign, not all of it, but within Italy, the papal states. The thought is that the church herself is a polity, it's a spiritual polity. The churches are in political structure, her own law, her own courts. And in are y'all seeing? Y'all can see everything, right? Okay. So in much of the medieval period, okay, the church's law was backed by the secular polity. Okay, that means that the church would authorize on occasion, or implicitly, or through a constitutional agreement or a contract or whatever, the state to act as its secular arm. So basically what you have is the church authorizing the state to enforce the church's law for spiritual ends, insofar as they bear on temporal ones. And integralist theory, and if you go back to the medieval period and you're reading political theory, the reason it's almost never taught is because it's got all this stuff about the church, and political philosophers are like, the church, who cares about the church? The church is just like this voluntary association. But in medieval political philosophy, it's really what we want to call two-polity political theory. So we're theorizing about the relationship between two polities, and it's a basic feature of political thinking at that time. And a critical question that arises is, if there's two polities, and remember, you're a member of the temporal polity, and if you're baptized, you're also a member of the spiritual polity, about which is supreme and in what sense. Now, there was a few people, and particularly in the 13th, 14th century, that we might call hierocrats, sometimes called hierocrats, where the Pope was thought to have enormous temporal power. For instance, the ability to make and unmake kings at will. This was not ever a very popular view outside of Rome, but it did have its defenders. Now, the other side of this, where the king has enormous ecclesiastical power, but no dogmatic power. King can't define dogma. That's much more common. So you see this, for instance, in the ecclesiastical structure of the Byzantine Empire, right? This kind of Caesaro-Papist model. But this has also come up in France under sort of Gallican ecclesiology, where the king can appoint bishops. Many thought the king could appoint his own bishops. And in fact, actually, if you go back far enough, and you wouldn't call it France then, I suppose, but Charlemagne called his own proposed ecumenical council in order to show that icons were idolatrous. So the tradition in France of the king having kind of greater sacral authority than the Catholic Church often wanted goes back a long way. So many pursued a middle ground, and one of the most famous theorists here is Cardinal Bellarmine, who was an extremely important thinker, impressed a great deal of people. The only person that Hobbes addresses at length and by name in Leviathan is Bellarmine, who he said made the best case for the papal side of the view that he wanted to resist, which for Hobbes saying nice thing about very many people is surprising. And for those of you who don't know, Cardinal Bellarmine was made a saint in 1930 and made a doctor of the church in 1931. So still carries a great deal of authority. So and Bellarmine defended this kind of middle ground position. The church has a nobler end, salvation, and so is in a sense the state's superior in that sense. But God has given the state its own independent mission to govern on behalf of the temporal common good. The church doesn't have that direct authority, but owing to its nobler purpose, the church could deputize the state to enforce its law when necessary. especially when that comes to threats to social and spiritual order. Heretics, right? Apostates, people who are leaving the faith but have been baptized, and in particular, and I've been studying the gruesome history here of the persistent unbelieving community, not just say remaining Muslims in Spain, but the Jews who were persistently marked, pushed into ghettos and so on. So the thought was, the rationales given are that heretics, apostates, and Jews are a threat to the kind of religious uniformity of Latin Christendom, and so are a threat to both the spiritual and social roots. So yeah, an unfortunate history, but nonetheless, it's worth understanding. I think that if you're going to go for a society that insists on a coercive degree of religious uniformity, you're going to run into these questions. Here's a formalization. This is just my attempt to formulate the range of views that we would want to call integralist. It's actually slightly over-inclusive, but it's worked for now. So it's a two powers thesis that you often hear discussed. So there's a natural authority. This is a theocentric theory of authority. Okay, so all authority is coming from God. God authorizes a state to advance the natural common good, G, of a community, C. Then there's the church. God authorizes the church to advance the supernatural good, S, of all baptized persons, in C. And finally, to advance the supernatural common good, the church may mandate state policies backed by certain civil penalties. In the medieval period, this included heretics who were unrepentant could be burned alive. It actually wasn't that common before, say, the 12th century or 11th century. And actually, the church learned it from kings. So I'm not trying to pin this on Catholics. Anglicans burned a lot of people for their size early on. So sometimes the penalties could be extremely severe. But the goal is you use the policies and the penalties in order to advance the supernatural good directly. So the church can't say, look, people need to eat to go to mass, so we'll set agricultural policy, right? Like that's too indirect. It has to be something like the heretic is a danger to the spiritual unity of Latin Christendom, and so they've just got to be silenced or recant or something along those lines. So that's just how I'm going to understand the range of integralist positions. Now, the supernatural sovereignty condition has another name if you look throughout the tradition. If you look in the Counter-Reformation period, this is often called the indirect power of the Pope. So you don't have direct temporal authority, but indirect authority insofar as temporal matters bear on spiritual ones. So that's the view, as I understand it. Now, there's one thing I'm going to jump to, because I have to keep up with time, is this question of what makes one a citizen of the heavenly polity. And the tradition is clear, it's baptism. Now, for many people today, baptism is something that you wait to do until you're of age. But of course, many churches baptize infants and always have, Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, for instance. And so it was thought that when one was baptized as an infant, that one would be a member of the spiritual polity, which means that if you're validly baptized as an infant and you live in a Christian state, Catholic state at least, that you can be brought under penalties for heresy, even if you were never a believer, with the exception of whatever noetic effects baptism has as an infant, if it has any at all. So Erasmus, wrote this commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. In the beginning, he makes a suggestion. It really is a suggestion that, well, maybe we want to wait until the baptized have come of age, and they can actually understand what they're getting into. And then we ask whether they affirm their baptismal vows. And if they do, we can enforce ecclesiastical law against them. Otherwise, all we can do is deny them the sacraments. Now, this is during the Counter-Reformation. And the Parisian School of Theology, like, almost immediately censored sin. I think they had one very practical reason, which is this is effect to say, hey, you're baptized as an infant. Do you want to be Protestant or Catholic? And at the time, I think not giving people that choice. But there was a theological claim made. And so they said this, and the Council of Trent actually makes this a canon. Now, its authority in the Council of Trent is disputed, whether it can be reformed or not. I won't speak to that here. but the integralists think it isn't. But here's what they say. It's a little bit clearer here than it's in Trent. If anyone says that when they grow up, remember, this is an anathematization, so we're describing the position that they're going to condemn. If anyone says that when they grow up, those baptized as little children should be asked whether they wish to affirm what their godparents promised in their name when they were baptized, and that when they reply that they have no such wish, they should be left to their own decision and not in the meantime be coerced by any penalty into the Christian life, except that they be barred from the reception of the Eucharist and the other sacraments until they have a change of heart, let him be anathema. So Erasmus's position is condemned. Now he goes back and forth with the Parisian school. It's like, it's just a suggestion. I mean, come on, the claim here, the theological claim, is that baptism alone suffices to make one a citizen of the church. And so it also suffices to put one under the secular Rome, that is, the church authorized state to enforce its law. Okay, so if you're baptized as an infant, that is sufficient. If you grow up at least in a majority Catholic state or something maybe more committed than that, you can be prosecuted for ecclesiastical crimes. You preach heresy, you're unrepentant. It doesn't matter if you were never Catholic. It doesn't matter. If you're a Protestant, it doesn't matter. If you were baptized and you were never raised a Christian at all, it would still count. So baptism alone makes one a citizen of the church. That's extremely critical. And it's critical to integralism because they think that when Trent elevated this censure into a canon, and Thomas Pink, one of the leading integralists, argues that this is irreformable, and he has a debate with John Finnis about this. He's saying this is an irreformable teaching of the church. And so when the church establishes its political ideal, that is integralism, what Pink thinks is the church's historical political ideal, that people would be under ecclesiastical censure for being simply in virtue of being baptized, as long as they weren't forcibly baptized as adults. Now, there is a complicated question about whether you can baptize a child validly against their parents' will. I won't get into that controversy. Suffice it to say, it's a very nasty history, and Scotus was wrong and Aquinas was right in opposing some of the grosser abuses. I'm going to skip Pope Leo XIII. There is a passage in his piece, Immortale Deis, encyclical on the Christian Constitution of States, that makes it sound like he adopts the spiritual sovereignty condition or supernatural sovereignty condition. It looks like most of Leo's defenders and his critics, Maritain and Murray, thought that he was, in fact, an integralist. The problem is this passage itself is actually strictly underdetermined. So I'll just gonna skip it for a moment. Okay, so you do have popes that at least don't say anything that contradicts integralism until the 20th century. Not to say that they were integralists, just to say you don't get people saying, no, this is out. Like, this is just the wrong view. This isn't even the ideal. That comes about in the 20th century. Although that's partly because the Catholic distinction between ideal and non-ideal political theory is invented in the middle of the 19th century. It sort of would be odd to say, oh, they were conceiving of it as the ideal the whole time. It assumes a distinction that I think was made in part to soften the blow of some Pius IX's anti-liberalism in the 19th century. But one of the things that's going on in the lead up to the Second Vatican Council is the experience of the Second World War in the church, which is dramatic. And the church decides that it's more kind of rearguard defensive posture following the French Revolution and throughout much of the 19th century. It had already been moving away from in a big way, but it was going to move away in a permanent way. The church wanted to be part of the new international post-war order, the moral order, things like the UN Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is one of the reasons that the church wants to make an announcement or some kind of promulgation of doctrine at the Second Vatican Council that says, look, we're on board with the kind of human rights regime. This is one of the things I think that the church is wanting to say to the world, not in some way to sort of suck up to the world, but I think to really just say, this is who we are, like this is our understanding. And so people in democratic societies don't have to be suspicious of Catholics as bad citizens. There are a number of Catholic theologians who are genuinely concerned about the status of Catholics if something like what was then not called integralism, but if something like integralism were seen as the goal, because the thought would be that ultimately then Catholics are subversives, right? And you get back to Locke's view of Catholics in a democratic polity. So I won't go through all the details of the backstory of Vatican II or anything here, but its most controversial decision was the formulation and promulgation of the document known as Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Human Religious Freedom. So here's one of its claims, okay? Like, just hold integralism in mind while you listen to this, okay? This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups or of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others within due limits. They're not hiding much within due limits, by the way. There's no exception for the baptized here. There's no like, oh, you can coerce the baptized, but not the unbaptized. I mean, it looks on the natural read. No coercion in matters of faith. And it isn't a pragmatic claim that could like change. They cite universal moral principles, okay? The council further declares that the right of religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society, any society, is governed, and thus is to become a civil right. These liberties, if you go through Dignitatis Humanae, it's just massive. It's beautiful. I love it. I love the document. Worship, or organization, education, parents' rights, press, speech, so on. It looks like, and this is what many people at the time thought they were doing, was kind of setting aside the non-authoritative or the non-dogmatic claims, political claims, that particularly Pius IX and Leo XIII had claimed. The integralism was being set aside. In fact, I just saw a quote from Pope Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger saying that they were setting aside the syllabus. That's how he thought it was going, setting aside the syllabus of errors, which was Pius IX's ferociously anti-liberal document that many integralists think is taught de fide. I think they're almost certainly wrong about this, but nonetheless, that's what they think. So the church embraces constitutional democracy, universal human rights as a matter of what we could call its official theology. This questions, many saying the council, Second Vatican Council is just pastoral, it's not ecumenical. So you might say, well, Dignitatis Humanae isn't dogmatic. I'm not going to touch that. It's just the way that some people dismiss the council, or at least try to weaken it. So the official theology of the church isn't necessarily what is actually its dogma, but the way that it conceives of itself at a particular point in time, and then what it teaches more broadly. This is a term for Pinks. Maybe it's not helpful, but many conservative Catholics continue to have real reservations about Vatican II, or at least what came to be called the spirit of Vatican II. And the remaining integralists, and there were a number of them, felt that DH forced them to take an oppositional stance toward the Vatican II and church leadership. World War II to the 21st century, liberal democracy is doing great. Church seems to be on board by and large, with some important exceptions like with abortion and euthanasia, contraception. The church accumulates cultural losses, and there is this seeming discontinuity between Leo's teaching and the previous teachings of the church, and then Dignitatis Humanae. So starting in the late 2000s, Thomas Pink, who's an excellent philosopher at University College London, and a pretty traditional Catholic, a leading scholar of the Counter-Reformation, especially Suarez's moral, political, and legal thought. And Pink thought the official theology of Vatican II accommodated modernity too much. And his kind of stated goal isn't political. It's not like the American integralists, for those of you aware of them. It's purely a spiritual goal of renewal, getting the church to reconcile it with who she was and who she continues to be. So his goal is church renewal, not politics. On that basis, he starts to think again about the integralism versus Dignitatis Humanae. And here he develops this new interpretation, which, the vast majority of people who study this reject. I actually think he has some interesting points. I used to actually think his argument was successful, but I'm now sort of on the fence. So he says, look, dignitatis humanae declares as a matter of law, natural law and revelation, a transcendent right of religious freedom against the state. But of course, DH is silent on any right of religious freedom against the church. In fact, many of the council fathers said, yeah, we couldn't really agree on the coercive authority of the church, like can the church have heresy trials anymore, just internal to itself. They said they would never have come to an agreement. So strictly speaking, you know, the dignitatis humanae, yeah, it's talking about the state, it's not talking about the church. And it's of course the case that the church can use spiritual punishments like excommunication to maintain its mission. Like no one is going to say seriously like that an organization can't remove people from itself a lot of the time. That may damage the freedom of association of that organization. Now there are exceptions to this. Again, I'm not going to give you any qualification because I'll never get through all this. So dignitatis humanae, though, Pink says, and this is the move, and this is the move that most people reject, which is that DH is also silent about another power of the church, and that's the power of the church to deputize the state to enforce its law. Now, when I read it, I say, look, no state can use religious coercion, even the church authorized state. And since it doesn't make an exception for the church authorized state, I just reason to say, well, it must be rejecting integralism, the supernatural sovereignty position. But Pink sees a different way. He says, well, look, the church, he's not talking about the church. And so if the church has the power to authorize the state to act as its secular arm, dignitatis humanae is entirely silent about that. Entirely silent about it. So Pink says integralism is no longer church policy, but that could change. He says for centuries, the church saw herself as a coercive authority. Part of facing up to the church's past is to recognize this fact. So I won't go through, but basically like Pink was on a one-man mission. And his posted some of his papers on academia.edu. And there were a group of younger integralists who they weren't fully integralists yet. This is about 10 years ago, that happened upon some of his talks and his papers. And they were like, oh, wait, we don't want to be opponents of the church. Like we want to be loyal to the church. But now if Pink's right, we can reject liberalism. Like we can reject it completely because we can reject this right of religious liberty because we can be loyal to the church and we can reject liberalism at the same time. And for a lot of people, that was extremely exciting. Extremely exciting. And this is how a lot of this energy got released. This is all these people, young people in particular, who were suspicious of liberal order, and Pink had opened the door. Completely without realizing that thousands of people would walk through, including a professor at Harvard Law School, who's really good at Twitter. So young Catholic intellectuals of a conservative bent increasingly feel betrayed by liberal order. A lot of people, some people didn't anticipate the level of social stigma that many people would face for more conservative positions of sex and gender within institutions of higher education and so on. And some people said, as many people said at the time, around Vatican II, I mean, not long after, like Archbishop Lefebvre, of course, that hostility to the church was baked into liberal democratic order of law. So Catholics have to pursue a radical alternative, go back to integralism. I won't go through the story. It's kind of fun, but basically, I just say this. Pink made it possible for Catholics to oppose liberal order while remaining loyal sons and daughters of the church in their own minds. And this is important because people who opposed dignitatis humanae before Pink were Lefebvrists, and essentially members of the Society of St. Pius the sorry. I think you cannot be a layman and be a member of the Society of St. Pius IX or Pius X, SSPX. Sorry. But you can go to their churches. And they rejected dignitatis humanae as heretical. We're in a period, although Father Rooney will correct me here about whether they were officially schismatic or not, or that they were initially or not, but we can talk about that here now. The point is that the people that opposed dignitatis humanae were either schismatics or like, I mean, because Archbishop Lefebvre, I think, ordained his own bishops, and can't do that. Can't do that. So, you know, Pink comes along and says, no. We can be completely loyal to the church. We're not Lefebvrists. We're not schismatics. We're not going to ordain our own clergy. Okay. we're on board with the church as she is. We love the church as she is, but liberalism has got to go. Hook, line, and sinker. So intellectual demand was there. Pink was the supply. Again, we won't go through it, but a lot of this started on social media. The big thing started to happen in 2016. Donald Trump's election kind of made a whole range of anti-liberal positions on the right, kind of opened the door to just a huge range of positions. And this was also the year that Adrian Vermeule converted to Catholicism and was starting to be openly integralist on Twitter. And for whatever reason, you get this whole online community on Facebook, on Twitter, on blogs, and then all of a sudden they start getting mentioned in like Catholic newspapers, and then they start getting mentioned in secular newspapers. And it's just this whole internet phenomenon. And if we're going to assess its truth or falsity, okay, we have to interrogate its central moral claim, which is the one I think that most people, including the vast majority of Catholics, including the vast majority of Catholic theologians, find morally counterintuitive. Okay, and this is the integralist theology of baptism. They almost never talk about it, except for Pink, who writes long stuff on the theology of baptism. But if their claim, they have, well, here, I'll lay it out for you. So American integralists said they were on board with Pink's reinterpretation. It's overwhelmingly dominant among them. There are a few others floating around that don't even entirely understand, but there's one, but Pink's one is the big one. So no forced baptism. You can't religiously coerce the unbaptized, period. Okay, and that's been actually the church dogma for a very, very long time. But if the church could readopt integralist policy, which is not something that Pink thinks is wise to do, incidentally, but many of the American integralists are completely serious about trying to do. Their hope is to construct a new and powerful Catholic state and then to have a reunification of the church. Really. And in such a state, the baptized will be treated differently than the unbaptized. It's a lot like an Islamic state, where Muslims are subject to certain kinds of privileges, but also certain kinds of punishments. And in fact, Vermeule has even said, like, Islam kind of has the right idea when it comes to religion and politics. It's just they have the wrong religion. But of course, in Islam, there's not a sharp distinction between the two powers, obviously. It's a kind of very different approach. But point is, if you're in the group, the Muslim Ummah or Catholic Church, you're subject to certain kinds of restrictions. So again, relations not unlike the application of Sharia law to Muslims, which actually one of the hudud punishments is capital punishment for apostasy. That's not required. And in fact, there's a huge amount of Sharia law that's like devoted to kind of like not having to do the few hudud punishments like cutting people's hands off for theft. So it actually, the hudud punishments are very, very rare, but except like, you know, a few different regimes. Point is, so I'm not trying to say like, make unfair generalizations about Muslims. It's important to be very careful about this. But the thought was that apostasy is indeed a crime that can be prosecuted in ordinary courts. And it's not a completely theocratic vision, okay, in the broad sense. So you have religious liberty for unbaptized Jews, Muslims, and so on. And it would be extensive because, look, dignitatis humanis, they have all these rights. But the American state would be coercively Catholic, and the liberal faith would be conquered and subdued under Catholic leadership. Because one of the things that the American integralists say is that liberalism is kind of poison. So you can't just get a little bit of it. It's going to spread, and so it has to be completely eradicated. Okay, so for Vermeule, liberalism has this inner liberationist tendency, in much the way that Marx thought that capitalism had this internal kind of tendency to undermine itself. And so Vermeule's kind of, you know, his thought that liberalism is going to collapse is a lot like Marx's thought that capitalism was going to collapse. Marx had better arguments. I mean, make of that what you will, but still, that's the idea. Liberalism just kind of gets made a minority religion. That's kind of their take. So the entire integralist project then, and you know, you can now kind of see this, and I'm inevitably going to go over time, but you know, is it depends on a single moral claim. Okay. Baptism must transform religious coercion from unjust to just. If you can religiously coerce the unbaptized, you're not just in violation of earlier church dogma, you're in violation of Dignitatis Humanae as Pink interprets. But if you say you can't religiously coerce the baptized, then Pink will say you're in violation of the Council of Trent. And the other, in the teachings, the authoritative teachings of Pope Leo XIII. And actually, Pink doesn't talk much about Pius IX, but the American integralists talk about him all the time. So maybe the syllabus of errors is document. So the integralists are stuck with this. Okay, they've got to say this: baptismal religious coercion of the unbaptized, always wrong, always wrong. But baptized religious coercion is sometimes permissible. So that's the claim. And this is deeply puzzling. Okay, we have moral reason to oppose forced baptism, decisive moral reason, even according to integralists who have done the reading. And you might think, like, surely those reasons apply to those baptized as infants. I have this case I was going to use, it was just too ridiculous, where I imagined there being a nurse in a multicultural society that every time she gets an infant, she baptizes them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and then she gives them to her parents and doesn't tell them. And so over the years, like, there are thousands and thousands of people of all kinds of different religions and nationalities and so on. And it turns out, boom, they're all citizens of the state, can all be prosecuted for heresy all of a sudden when she reveals it. It was pretty silly. It was a way of trying to make the reductio go. But the simpler point, without going into a case like that, is just like, look, the moral reasons to not forcibly baptize seem to suggest a more general, deeper moral principle against religious coercion. Okay. Now, Catholics say, and I, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I mean, I agree, like 95%, Catholics say baptism involves a massive ontological change in the person. Sin is forgiven, the supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and love are implanted. The will has the capacity to unite with God. But then the question is, how does grant all this? Okay, how does that explain why baptism transforms religious coercion from unjust to just? So if baptism is a big deal, okay, it's wonderful, it's a big deal, but how does these features transform coercion from unjust to just? Aquinas saw this tension, sees it very clearly. But my thought is that however beautiful and powerful baptism may be, nothing about it explains why it should legitimize religious violence. A standard explanation is like, look, this is just like birthright citizenship, right? It's just your second birth, right? One becomes a citizen of the church, subject to all the rights and responsibilities thereof, just like when you're born into a country, you're subject to the law, whether you like it or not. Okay, but that does defer answering the question. If you ask, well, why is it the case that you become a citizen of the state by birth? Because there are plenty of states you don't have birthright citizenship. It's just a convention, and a convention can be changed. But baptism bestows citizenship necessarily. Now, since it's by divine decree, it might not be sort of strictly necessary truth. I don't know how to think about the modality of it, really. Maybe some metaphysician wants to help me. So I'll just leave the claim there. Baptism bestows citizenship, at least not as a matter of any human convention or any human act. Maybe it's a irrevocable divine act. I doubt it. I think it's an irrevocable divine act. Aquinas says, look, here's what this is like. This is like making a vow, or it is in some cases making a vow, because the baptismal liturgy includes vows by godparents. Or if you are baptized as an adult, then the vow is made. You make the vow. Right. And the thought is like, look, you can't force someone into a vow. The vow has to be made voluntarily, but then they can be enforced, right? You can't be forced into a contract in most cases, right? But you can be forced to hold to what you agree to. Okay. And this Aquinas seems to, he doesn't say that baptism is a vow or that baptism is accompanied by a vow. It's kind of unclear. And so there's a lot of ambiguity that I try to work through here. Remember the Trent canon, okay? Even infant baptism makes one a citizen of the church. But here's the trouble for Thomas. The infants make no vows. Infants make no vows. So the infant, so if you're going to appeal to a vow, you're going to say, look, baptism's a vow, or it's accompanied by a vow. How does that work in the case of the baptized infant? Right, because the integralists have locked themselves in. They have said it is a de fide teaching of the Roman Catholic Church that baptism alone suffices to make one a citizen of the church. Okay, and they also think it's part of dogma that the church can authorize the state to enforce its law. So if you go with the vowing strategy, it's weird because infants don't make any vow. Now, baptism is thought to change the will. It doesn't cause a choice. Baptism isn't causing the infant to freely choose to affirm certain things. Now, if you look at the Parisian censure of Erasmus, it says that the godparents make the vow, and this is hundreds of years after Aquinas. So what you might think is, okay, well, the way the infant becomes a citizen of the church is they're baptized and their godparents vow to raise them in the faith and so on, and then that makes the infant under church law. So, but let's allow the claim, which many will find strange, but let's just allow it, that A's promise can make B a citizen, okay, without B's consent. Okay, let's just allow that. You could very plausibly dispute it, but just allow it. Okay. Let's ask the following question. Okay, for the infant, baptism cannot be a vow. There's no vow made. Okay, it has to be some kind of vow that accompanies the baptism. But this raises the question about their logical separability. Okay, is the vow necessary for citizenship in the church? Well, if it is necessary, baptism is insufficient on its own. This weakens baptism. I think it weakens its power in a way I actually think surely dogmatically unacceptable to Catholics. Maybe not. It disincentivizes vowing in a way. So like people will say, well, look, I don't want to put my godchild under, severe criminal liabilities. So, Father, whomever, will you please baptize my child? I'm not going to make any vow because, again, it comes with severe criminal liabilities. So please, just will you baptize my child? And I just think it would be kind of weird for a priest to say, no, I won't do it. Now, maybe some priests would refuse, but it is a weird incentive structure. It disincentivizes godparents to vow to raise their children in the faith. Because presumably baptism in this case would have its positive effects without giving one the legal liabilities. Okay, but if you say the vow isn't necessary, then baptism is sufficient on its own, and the vows aren't really helping much. They're not really explaining things. So I don't think Aquinas' solution here works. I also don't know for sure if Aquinas would apply it to infants. Okay, but the integralists are clear when they're, yeah. Okay, so I thought, okay, look, I'm going to try to help. Okay, I'm going to try to repair this problem. Let's see what I can do. So for the integralists, the church is a polity. Okay, and the integralist state is a diarchical polity, right? There's two polities. Perhaps we can adapt theories of political obligation, like obligations to obey the state, to solve the baptism puzzle. There's the standard list: hypothetical consent, gratitude, fair play, associative duties, natural duties. All I'm going to talk, I think vowing's like hypothetical consent, and structurally leave that out. I think fair play only works if gratitude already works. Natural duties is kind of weird because these are baptismal duties, so they're not natural duties. So I'm just going to talk about gratitude and associative duties very quickly because actually the adaptation is just awkward because it pretty clearly doesn't work. So here's how the gratitude theory would go. Okay, here's why baptism is a normative transfer, why it makes religious coercion okay. Baptism bestows an infinite benefit, and we should be grateful for that. And of course, it's Christian teaching, we should be grateful for God's gifts and the gift of baptism. Of course, like that's obvious. Okay. And the nice thing here is the aptness of our gratitude tracks whether we're baptized or not. Okay. So, I mean, it's at least a potential candidate because we receive the benefits of baptism with baptism. And so we should be grateful. If we're not baptized, we don't have them. Although there are cases where you can receive the benefits without being baptized. So that complicates this. But again, I'm leaving that out. But how does gratitude explain why the baptized may be forced to obey the integralist state? Because typically when bear gratitude towards someone, we're grateful to someone. we want to return the favor. And in many cases, we feel that we're under an obligation to do so, at least to some extent, in a way that the person would appreciate. Right? It's like when you give someone a Christmas gift, you put a lot of thought into it, right? Like you're trying to reciprocate benefits in the way that they would want. So your thought is, we want to reciprocate benefits in the way that God would want. Because you might think there's lots of ways to reciprocate benefits to the church, like donate some money, help them build a church, or donate some land, or something like that. Like, why is the way to reciprocate the benefits of gratitude to God to obey the integralist state in these potentially quite barbaric conditions? Okay. You have to think that this is what God wants, right? You have to think, well, God wants us to reciprocate in this way, right? But like, why would you think that unless you are already an integralist in the first place? So you need that step in a gratitude theory to say, look, the giver, the benefiter, okay, wants you to reciprocate the benefits in that way. Because otherwise, I do think we typically think it's open to people to respond to a benefit as they see fit within some limits. But really, gratitude theories move the ball forward. Then there are associative theories. And associative theories say that one acquires enforceable duties to the state simply in virtue of being a member of the polity. So it's like an analogy of familial duties, right? Like, you have a child, you have duties to the child, didn't matter whether you consent, okay? And if you're a kid and you grow up and your parents get older or whatever, you have an obligation to take care of them. Consent doesn't enter into it, doesn't matter. You have the duties because you're a member of the organization, a member of the family. Now, associative theorists of obligation struggle with the fact that our membership in the state is much more attenuated than our membership in the family, right? But here's the cool thing for the integralist is that one becomes a member of the church through baptism, and the relations with other Christians are more intimate than those of the family. Okay? One becomes a member of the body of Christ. Okay. And so the thought is like, okay, look, you become baptized, that makes you a member of the church. These duties can be enforced in the same way that, say, a parent's duties to their children can be enforced, or ordinary familial duties could be enforced. So on analogy. There's a couple of problems here. I actually think associative duties become questionable if you can't actually exit the organization. And of course, baptism is an indelible mark, so you can't be unbaptized. But I'll leave that aside. There's also this problem of bad organizations where, like, look, if you're a member of an organization and they're trying to harm you and are terrible to other people, then, you know, you don't have an obligation to obey them anymore. And you might just say, you know, there are situations in which, say, a part of the church may hurt somebody and they're not obliged anymore, even if they're baptized. The integralists can respond and say, well, it's a good organization because it's God's organization, even if the people within it are bad. So even if, then they have to say that you're obligated to obey the church authorized state, even if the church authorized state is massively unjust. Now they can there's a way out of this, but nonetheless, I do think the problem of equal organizations applies here. But the real problem here, actually, and this is the weird thing about associative theories in general, which is that the associative theory isn't really an underlying explanation of obligation. It's just an intuition about when they hold, right? It just says, look, that obligations to the church or the state, they're analogous to familial duties, which we think that we have and can be enforced in certain circumstances. Of course, many familial duties, like the vast majority of them, can't be enforced. But nonetheless, it's not really a deeper explanation of why we have the obligations. It's really just a claim by analogy. So here's the way to see it. You can see this pretty clearly, I think. Suppose the integralist is trying to convince the conservative non-integralist Catholic of their position. And you say, yeah. You think it's weird that baptism is an order transformer, but guess what? Part of your membership of the church implies that you have an obligation to obey the church authorized state. To which the response is, well, why? Like, what's the reason? And they say, well, it's just part of being a member of the association. But I don't see how this advances the dialectic at all, because it's, the conservative Catholic is going to be like, yeah, I have all kinds of duties to the church. And that is in virtue of my baptism and being a member. But how does that explain why the church can authorize the state to enforce its law against me simply in virtue of being baptized as an infant? So the idea is that the associative theory doesn't explain that extra integralist bit, right? The additional stuff that the integralist holds to that non-integralists don't. So the problem with any of these secular theories is that political philosophers began crafting these theories for one-polity political theories, our duties to the state. And we just don't have to dig very deeply to see that modern theories of political obligation are going to struggle to explain a two-polity political theory's authority. And the problem is that contemporary integralists have offered no resolution of this baptism problem at all. And so I don't know what they want to say. And I've given this talk a couple of times, and a lot of us have kind of puzzled about what could be said. Some people have suggested some creative stuff that I haven't had time to go through. One of these suggested by Mark Murphy is you say just the following. You say, look, we know this. Baptism creates rights and responsibilities, even if we don't know how. The dogma here is clear. Okay, so the integral says, I'm not going to try to explain why baptism creates rights and responsibilities. I'm just going to take that as dogma. I'm not going to try to give an argument for it. I'm not going to explain it except to say that it's dogma. Then, if the church can authorize the state, then baptism would be a normative transformer. The church can create rights and responsibilities without consent. So if it can authorize the state, then baptism is a normative transformer. So then everything in the argument becomes reliant on this idea that the church can authorize the state to enforce its law, which is just the integralist claim anyway. But there's just a bunch of issues. So, I had a conversation with a couple of different people about this, and they thought, look, the church doesn't have the authority to use physical coercion. It can't delegate a power that it lacks. You can't delegate a power you don't have. To which some say, look, the church does have the power of physical coercion. It's just not competent to use it. So so the state uses it. But this raises the question about, like, well, there were papal states. The church was using physical coercion in a way. I mean, the papal states, as I understand them, were kind of at times comically badly run, but so were many secular states. So yeah, some people say, yeah, the church can physically coerce. There's also this further question, which is that, look, I mean, maybe the church can use coercion in some sense, but there are good arguments that natural law forbids religious coercion in general, on which baptism doesn't affect them. For instance, like standard new natural law arguments from the character of the good of religion. And the fundamental problem here is that you need to have already determined whether natural law permits religious coercion before we can even determine whether the church can authorize the state to enforce its law, right? Again, there are plenty of natural law theorists today that will well, no, religious coercion violates natural law because it contorts or distorts or destroys or diminishes the natural good of religion, which has to be pursued freely. So anyway, this is one suggestion that I've been thinking about over the last month or two, and I'm not sure that it works. Mark wasn't saying that it worked either. It's just trying to sort of generate as many different responses as I can. Okay, all right, so I'll just finish here. So establishing integralism would require a wild reversal of the Catholic Church's self-understanding. As far as I can tell, not one bishop of 5600 is openly integralist, and Pope Francis has privately described integralism as a plague. I also think it's pretty clear, as I argue in the book, that integralism can only arise by destroying a competitive party system with all the advantages, just the pure instrumental advantages that come from a competitive party system, like peaceful transitions, avoiding famines, and those kinds of very basic things. So I think in diverse and complex societies, integralism is going to destabilize unless it becomes just extremely authoritarian and dictatorial. But then if it does that, it's inevitably going to violate other Catholic moral teachings. So one of the things I say in the book is integralism is morally infeasible. You could get to it, but not in a way that honors Catholic moral teaching. So instead of just saying, oh, it's unrealistic, the better thing to say is you could do it, but it would require more sin. You're going to have to hurt a lot of people deliberately. You got to plan it. But a central problem, a moral problem, okay, is its injustice. Okay, that's the issue, is that religious coercion seems wrong. It doesn't seem like baptism changes whether religious coercion is wrong. It's just not obvious. There doesn't seem to be any good explanation out there. Integralists haven't really offered one. All right, took longer than I hoped, but thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take a 5-minute break now and come back at 10:03. So if you have a question that you want to ask, just send me a private message in the chat, and I'll add you to the queue.
Good. Right. I could still back up. I lied.
Kevin, would you be, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could go back to the slide you were talking about Aquinas' view of baptism. Is that
Oh,
possible?
I was just, I was, that was not Aquinas's, from Aquinas. The claims I made about baptism were like lifted from the catechism. This is just to get at the consensus position. But I think Aquinas' doctrine of baptism could be different in various ways. I was just, if the integralist goal is to be loyal to the church's teaching, they've got to affirm that.
Yeah, then no, that's okay. We can talk about it when you come back. I'm not trying to stop you. I just was curious.
Yeah.
I missed the slide I was looking for.
Oh yeah. I should have sent the slides. I mean, it's not a big deal to share them. I don't know. I'm a host, I think, so maybe I can. See if I can. Yeah, so a condition of receiving these, all of, yeah, if people want them, I could send them to them, just chat me or whatever else. But I'll send them to you.
So I think maybe Nevin can get us started, and then if you have a question, just write question to me in the chat.
Thanks. So thanks, Kevin. That was a very interesting talk. So I'm thinking through the tension that you identify between, like, trying to defend this disanalogy between the baptized and the unbaptized. I wonder if this is a way to defend it. And I haven't read Dignitatis Humanae, so it might be that what I'm about to say is inconsistent with that. But I wonder if the integralist could say that, well, the way that you're talking about things assumes a kind of, the religious liberty is based on individual freedoms, and you're like taking the individual to be the fundamental unit of society, which is a particular liberal idea, right? But we shouldn't take individuals to be the fundamental unit of society. We should take families to be the fundamental unit of society. And we can't coerce like a, so I'm thinking something like this, like the parents of a baptized child choose for that child to be baptized, and they have authority over the child, and in virtue of their authority, then they give the church some authority over their child. But if a family is Jewish, say, well, the church doesn't have authority over that family, and so the church can't coerce that family
unless their nanny has illicitly baptized their child, in which case they can.
Well, yeah. So then there's so you mentioned in the talk this question of can babies be baptized against their parents' will?
Yeah.
And so I think that the view that I'm sketching would have to say no. That's unjust. So if we added that in, then the idea would be like the fundamental rights are based on families rather than on individuals. Parents have authority over their children, so they can baptize their children or choose to have their children baptized, and then that gives authority to the church. There's maybe some trickiness there, and well, what about when, like, child is baptized, becomes an adult, and then chooses to, they say, I don't want to be a Catholic and I don't want to baptize my own kids. So there's like, you get kind of a weird thing where you have authority, like a baptized Catholic who then says, I don't want to be a Catholic, has authority over, say, his own children, but not over his own faith. So that's kind of weird.
You're reasoning
Yeah.
it the same way I did. It's just like,
Okay.
you like, if they go this way, then weird things happen immediately. So the issue with Dignitatis Humanae is that I was reading Archbishop Lefebvre, and he describes his arguments with other people at the council. And the future Pope John Paul II said, well, you know, against the communists, this religious liberty stuff was pretty useful. And the reason I bring this up is because, of course, Pope John Paul II was imprisoned by the Polish communists. So, and one of the things that develops out of this his kind of personalist philosophy is like, it's supposed to be able, and a lot of the influential personalist moral philosophy at the council is meant to try to get this idea of human rights grounded in human dignity without liberal individualism. Maybe that's an unstable position. It's certainly, the integralists certainly think this, but they're trying to say, yeah, no. There's universal human rights, but and that includes the right of religious liberty. And so you read Dignitatis Humanae, it looks individualistic in certain ways. Now, it stresses the freedom of organizations too. There's plenty of other Catholic doctrine that condemns in all sorts of forms of individualism. But yeah, I don't think the document itself allows for that move. And if you do allow for the move of families, it does start to create really weird implications. You get all these questions about like separated baptisms, or like, suppose someone never knew, like they were baptized validly in the American wilderness and never heard of the Catholic Church. I mean, there are all of these counterexamples. So I think they've really painted themselves into a corner.
Yeah, I guess that maybe this would be an interesting place for integralists to push, in as much as the family is already difficult for liberals to deal with. What are liberals supposed to say about children and so on? Like, these are not fully autonomous individuals. And it's a place where, as you mentioned in one of your arguments on the integralist behalf, where like we tend to think we do have duties that we haven't chosen. But yeah, I see that there are, I agree, there are difficulties in going this route.
It's gonna be fascinating to see what they actually have to say. I haven't sent it to Pink because I think he was a referee. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So Cad Ledsham has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. So I just want to pose an elaboration of the associationist family model that would take away some of the puzzles and problems that you've put forward from it very quickly, and get your response. So instead of seeing it as just family membership, you strengthen the claim that baptism also bestows an identity, in the way that being born into a family just immediately bestows an identity. The good thing about a bestowed identity is that we don't sit around saying something is identical with itself or has this identity and that's mysterious. That's a good place to have a basic fact that you just take as a starting point. And that what you elaborate the family membership story by saying, first, it's an identity, and second, baptism is like adoption. So this is a nice biblical, theologically rich concept as well. So it's got, there's the faith, hope, and charity implanted characteristics that come with any baptism that bestow a general nature. And it's not elicited or chosen in any kind of social contract. So it's natural in one sense, but the whole situation is like an adoption. So it has an arbitrary allocation aspect. And the conflict between those two, I think, is what's causing some of your, to get sand in the gears of your mind about understanding the integralist claim.
The adoption thing is interesting because it's presumably an exercise of the divine will, and the And the question becomes, well, why is it the case that that adoption, which is a real relationship, why does it, suppose a non-integralist Catholic would say, I accept this, right? The question is, well, what's the explanation about why the church can go further and authorize this other institution?
Sorry, what is the other
Why does
institution? The
the
adoption.
state, the church, yes. So because the church has adopted someone
the
through
analogy
baptism,
there would be something like you are adopted, therefore you have certain rights to property and can and can't use certain property by virtue of a property system attaching itself to, in a remote way, the family relationship. Well, I don't see why that's very mysterious at all. There are all sorts of attendant and auxiliary arrangements and relationships that come along with family identity.
Yeah, but those are ones that the state creates, right? So those are ones that are created by convention, and so we're trying to figure out what is the convention that's established between church and state here. I
think the thing was in your Leo quote there, and how open-ended that was about whether you have a hierarchy or whether you have a fascist style parallel system where the state is ostensibly secular but takes instruction from the church on stuff the church is interested in. Franco or Salazar or someone, or a democratized version of that in De La Vera's Island.
So actually I want to give that reference.
I don't see why there couldn't be several different models of that, and I'm not sure that the church has to have a view on which model of those it actually works out for it, so long as it's whatever it's irritable about gets instituted.
Yeah, so no, that's problem. As far as how the state itself is structured to make decisions, Leo's clear that he's neutral on that question. That's right. The question is,
so is that
the following fact: the church adoption.
Is that position still?
That's an interesting. The Democratic case is an interesting boundary, but but you could have my view is you could have a democratic integralism, but not for very long.
Not for very long. Yeah,
but not very long.
Yeah.
But just to your question, the question is, what is the nature of the authorization relationship between the church and the state, however the state is structured, be it democratically or not. So that's the key, is how does adoption in the church explain how it can authorize the state? Because you say, oh, look, lots of relationships come with being a member of the family, but those are typically like legal relationships that are established by some kind of convention. And so my question was, regardless of how the state is structured, what's the convention that exists between the church and the state that explains why, oh, you're adopted as part of the church, so the state.
I wonder whether the problem there is not on the church side, but on the fact that you're operating with a singular concept of the state that might be modern, and the pre-modern state could be contracted with in a semi-family relationship by virtue of the fact that it was generally monarchical. And
yes, and that's actually very that's very clever because this is actually I think essential to how integralism ever looked plausible, was that Latin Christendom had institutionally regressed to the point where the distinction between a person and an office and an office holder had kind of fallen apart. And so the fact that you were a Christian king meant that you could say submit your regime, like your fief or whatever, you could submit it to the church. But that as soon as you have a society that distinguishes between office and office holder, the fact that the office holder is a Christian doesn't say very much about what the office can do.
It's not just office holder, it's also feudal relationships. For example, a noble's whole household would convert when the noble did. And everyone, it's the corollary of that sort of package of collective identity engagement with entering into the church.
Well, if we're back to collective, we're back to collective identity, then I think we're back to maybe something closer to.
Well, this thing may not be able to be pulled out of its medieval context, apart from the sort of thing that De La Vera did, which is the, okay, we're happy to take instructions from the church on stuff that the church asks us to look at. You know, it might actually be very more like reserve powers.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
James Dominic Rooney, you want to complete your question?
Right. So thank you again, Kevin. I know we talk about some of these things a lot. I want to sort of push on a. I'm wondering if we've gotten to the core of what they want to say. I agree with you. Baptism is going to have to transform religious coercion from unjust to just. I wonder if the way they really argue, I'm revising that paper you were talking about. And one of the things I was wondering is, it seems like the idea might be something like what we do with marriage. So individuals recognize marriage is a great good that happens through the vows, right? However, baptism creates a certain kind of good. It does, and it's a very valuable good. And by itself, the vows of marriage do not merit great punishment for like adultery, right? They don't mandate that there's any specific penalty for adultery. But people make arguments that adultery should be criminalized, because as soon as marriage is contracted, right, it's a social good that we should raise the social cost in order to protect this good by criminalizing adultery. And I have a feeling that's exactly why baptism is a normative transformer, is because it creates an immensely, powerful social good that we want to protect. And so we want to raise, so why would it be wrong to raise the social cost just like adultery? You might not have a personal reason to enter into, to want to like add further penalties to your marriage, right? When you take the marriage vows, you're not going to say, and I'm going to pay a private contractor to shoot me in the leg if I violate, the vows. So in the same way, you wouldn't have a reason when you go to get baptized to ask the priest, like, let's criminalize this, right? But you might think, well, there's a social good. It's the common good, right, that justifies criminalizing baptism, right? Violating baptismal promises, and not necessarily promises, violating the good of baptism, not being faithful.
Yeah. Okay, so that last bit actually may answer what my response is going to be. So the problem with actually a lot of the different rationales that I sometimes hear for integralism is that the preserving of the great good looks like it would justify religious coercion of the unbaptized. So the idea is, for instance, coercing someone to become baptized. Like, you wouldn't necessarily like just drag someone kicking and screaming, right? But like, you just use certain indirect kinds of coercion, monitoring, fines, stuff like that, to get people to, produce the great good of conversion, right? And this is, of course, what Suarez infamously defended for the Jews, which was forcing the Jews to listen to the gospel once a week, and the church having the power to forbade Jews from interacting with Christians, buying and selling, all kinds of different stuff. And the thought was, look, this is just indirect coercion. Just indirect. We're not forcing people to believe. And so my worry is that if you appeal to like the great good of being a Christian or one of those great goods. Now, you said we're going to use coercion to preserve the good of baptism. And then you might say baptism has to be free, or at least not done against the will. So as in the case of infants. So then you say this. Okay.
Correct. Good. So my claim would be something like the baptism done so you can make it charitable. You can say baptism in ordinary circumstances, being faithful to that is a great good. Not being faithful to like baptism that was done invalidly by a super soaker. I went into a synagogue and said, I baptize you, and spray down everybody and then criminalize it, right? That's insane, right? But in ordinary circumstances, you might think then being faithful to what you received is a great social value. Now, I should say, here's my justice argument. You can tell me what you think.
Yeah.
I think the justice argument goes like this. Thomas Aquinas said, I want to restore the soul body unity of baptism and citizenship. Now, I think that is where this goes wrong. It's not wrong that baptism is a great good, that even there might be good reasons for, like the church, right? This is the reason for church punishments, is like, it's good to be faithful to baptismal vows. We should like excommunicate people or encourage them to be faithful to them. The question is, when it applies in society, it seems to create disparate rights and liabilities, burdens and benefits for two different classes of people who are both equally members of society. And it looks like it just violates a principle of distributive justice, right? That normally you want to benefit the common good of everybody, not just the spiritual common good of the baptized. So that the structural inequality violates, we might say, Rawls's difference principle, but it also just violates intuitive principles of distributive justice, because the reason for the inequalities, that give certain people certain benefits or burdens that are disproportionate, is purely because of is justified only by appeal to the advancing of a spiritual common good, which is only for a certain segment of society, not by the common good of all. So that's why I would say it violates distributive justice.
Okay, so there's kind of two thoughts here. So my general reaction to the use coercion to protect baptism or whatever is that it's going to over justify coercion in a way that goes against DH. So for instance, like but then there's your second suggestion about, what's kind of this inequality. So I actually, this paper fell out of an earlier argument that I called the fairness argument, that I thought didn't work. Although I'm now back to thinking it worked. It's published online, but I wasn't circulating it because it was invited for a piece, and I just thought it didn't work. But that's essentially the argument that I make, which is that, look, I mean, effectively what you're going to have to choose between what I call thick integralism, where you prioritize protecting the spiritual good of the baptized, and the thin integralism, where you protect the religious liberties assigned by Dignitatis Humanae for Jews and Muslims and everybody else. And there's going to be a pretty serious conflict there, because if, for instance, Jews and Muslims have all the same, and the Catholic Church doesn't consider Mormons Christians, so it's like Mormons say too, they have all these liberties. They have freedom of speech, press, all of this stuff. That's inevitably going to affect the church. So yeah, what you're going to end up with is a kind of two-tiered system. So when I talk about a contemporary Sunni Islamic political theology that's anti-liberal, it has precisely the same issue. It has a general underlying commitment to the equality of persons. But then even Rashid Ghannouchi, the Tunisian politician who's got this nice treatise, Public Freedoms of the Islamic State, says, yeah, I mean, there's going to be second-class citizens, right? There's just going to be two classes of citizens, and some are going to have special privileges and some and others aren't. But he also wants to be egalitarian. And so I think those commitments are inconsistent. So I actually think you're right that when you implement an integralist regime, either it's not going to work very well, because there's just not a lot of religious coercion producing uniformity, if it does produce uniformity, or it's just going to create second-class citizenship in a way that's grossly inegalitarian and seems incompatible with basic Catholic principles of the equality of persons. So yeah, no, I think, yeah, because every regime that could even look integralist had second-class citizens. And I mean, that's even setting aside the case of women, which we shouldn't. I just mean religious minorities. And in fact, I mean, the ghettos in the papal states lasted for a very long time. And the rationales that were being given were precisely the spiritual harm stuff. It's this old argument from a kind of spiritual harm principle. And so effectively, you're boxing people into ghettos so they don't harm the spiritual unity of other people in the papal states. And this is going well into the late 19th century. So yeah, I actually think you're completely correct that just like it's a matter of implementation. You're not going to be able to preserve religious uniformity and then treat religious minorities as equals. It's just not going to work. Here's the problem: is the integralists, I think, are going to try to argue that the egalitarian principle any egalitarian principle that would have that consequence should be rejected in favor of egalitarian principles that wouldn't have that implication. And then the argument starts to get pretty complicated. So I set it aside. I think you're right. I'm not completely convinced. Anyway.
So this is a question from Michael Barbazats, which I'm going to read aloud. I'm wondering about the deeper history here of religious coercion. It seems to me that the real medieval interlocutors are the ones who did justify the violent coercion of Christians. I'm thinking particularly of the Gratian, I'm not sure that I pronounced that correctly, and the Corpus Iuris Canonici. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce
So he's
Latin.
talking about medieval canon law and medieval canon lawyers.
Oh yeah, Michael, you can ask it if you want. I mean.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
so I'm particularly thinking about the Corpus Iuris Canonici and its impact, and then how that was used historically in actual instances of widespread violent coercion, like the Albigensian Crusade, and particularly Gratian's concept of the just war theory, which is exactly what you're discussing in your talk. His framing is this, but it's very historically different, I think, in a way that's very interesting and could be of great utility to you in thinking about the different contexts between some of the medieval frames and the modern exigencies that the arguments you're engaging with or speaking to, that are really, really different in revealing.
Yes. Yes.
Auvergne, and also Innocent III. I think that they all are very formative. Like, Aquinas is really a footnote to what thinkers like this had already done in this genre.
Yes. So I have studied some of the medieval canon law, but I can't tell you whose code it is. So, but the stuff I have looked at is the canon law, the medieval canon law that developed, that eventually allowed for the burning of heretics, and the way that this led up to the trial of Jan Hus at the Council of Constance. And so that may be Gratian, but I don't know whether that's the code that contains the procedure for heresy trials. So a lot of the exigencies that I'm raising actually occurred in the late Middle Ages and helped to actually destroy the Middle Ages, because the Council of Constance, of course, with the burning of Hus, created as a backlash, these 4 Hussite rebellions. And when Luther found out about Huss's burning, based on his relatively minor deviations, that kind of went to full Luther. Well, I think if it weren't for the Hussites, the Lutherans might not have gotten off the ground. So yeah, my view was that, a lot, if you look at the way that St. Louis treated the Jews, rounding up, having to wear special clothes, although that was a canon of the Fourth Lateran Council, that Jews and Saracens had to wear special clothes so they wouldn't be confused with Christians. But also the rounding up and the incineration of Talmuds and things like that. So I actually think some of the stuff that I'm suggesting as like awful things that might happen are based on stuff that the canon law code immediately rationalized. And you mentioned the Albigensian Crusade as being one of them. Yeah, so I guess what I want to say is that, yeah, I mean, the bits, particularly my study of heresy trials, which I take to be overlapping, which you're recommending, what you're discussing. Yeah, I mean, it was extremely useful to see, even if it was as shocking as it was. I hope we're talking about the same thing. Do you want to tell me if I've gotten outside of what you're referring to?
No, definitely. Thank you for that. No, because I think one of the things that I was listening, because I've done a fair bit of work on how, in a very medieval vein, you can kill people for certain reasons like this. And one of the interesting things in the modern discussion, as you're running through it, which I am largely ignorant of, so I stay in the Middle Ages, is the preoccupation with baptism, which in most of the medieval discussions is taken as a given, and we extrapolate from there. And so I think that preoccupation strikes me as radically different. And also, of course, the fact that you could have a licit society that isn't coterminous with the church at all is a radical and extreme difference that really changes the thinking in extraordinary ways. You know, because you go from a system where you have really only exceptions that are tolerated because of technicalities, like Jews or Muslims when it's convenient. And that's it. And everybody else is a criminal. And so it makes it much simpler in that kind of logical world where anybody that separates from the one body can only be cancer. And there's only one logical response to cancer. And this is, you know, William Auvergne will lay this out very well, that killing someone who's separated from the church is actually to their benefit. So he makes it an argument that this is a true act of love and mercy to exterminate these people. And of course, that advice was being acted on if he wrote. So this is
Bellarmine has a series of justifications for killing heretics, and I don't remember that being one of them.
Yeah, but William was a very, very influential man and very important and very indicative.
Which William is this?
William of Auvergne. I can send you the reference if you want.
Yeah.
It's
I've read about him in Oakley's, in the Oakley trilogy, but it's like, in Thomas Fudge's book on the trial of Jan Hus about this, he does talk a great deal about how heretics were understood. It's like you rolled together like a leper and a terrorist and like and a racist, like you took everything that we immediately do to like place someone kind of outside the ordinary sphere of humanity and just rolled it into one big term and to try to convey how heretics were perceived. No, I think that is true for societies that achieved that intense degree of homogeneity. But I also think that actually in practice, you know, I think there are certain points in the medieval period where most Christians are are not living in Christian regimes because of Muslim conquest. You've also got the East, just being different for a long time. You have intermingling at various boundary points where there's huge numbers of religious minorities or Christian, and so I think, there's this presentation that like, well, look at like everybody's Catholic and everybody's baptized, and these are just like little exceptions. But then I think when you really start to look under the hood, there's Arians all over the place too. So I mean, I sometimes think, that's probably how a lot of people are thinking about it. I just don't know if that was, like you can imagine, like maybe like Ireland at a certain point gets completely converted to Catholicism, and then it's sort of sealed. But I imagine there's probably still a lot of pagans there too. So I guess all I'm saying is that I'm not sure there is a radical difference in degrees of heterogeneity in terms of belief. I mean, one of the hardest things to know about a lot of Latin Christendom and the medieval period, as in almost any other time period, is what religious piety, like how pious were people. I mean, and it's not even the same question across, that question doesn't even transfer across religions very well. Just focusing on Latin Christendom between the 11th century and 16th century, let's say, I just see a huge amount of underlying heterogeneity. People that can't read, whose priests can't read. Heavens no, we have no idea what they believed. Like, we just don't know, it's just extremely hard to tell. And I've even looked at some people trying to attempt to like estimate even like 13th century piety. And there's just all these extremely difficult, maybe like insuperable measurement problems. So for instance, let me give you an example. With the Cathar heretics in southern France, Andrew Willard Jones, who has this book, it's a little hagiographical of St. Louis, but before Church and State, talks about the Cathars as like this distinct heretical group with like this distinct priesthood and this distinct ideology or whatever. But then I was reading Mark Koyama's book on religion and toleration, which is from like a more economic historian perspective. And he actually argued that the Cathars, it's not clear how many of them there were, and it's not clear how many of the Southern French nobility were Cathars. And so how much St. Louis was just like trying to maintain control over Southern France. And, you know, once I started reading that, I thought, you know, there are people telling these stories about a kind of age of uniformity. But, you know, I mean, particularly you've got this huge frontier, but, you know, so yeah, I guess I would just want to say there might be a change in self-conception in some writers, but I'm not sure it's a change in experience on the ground, because I think everybody is aware of the pluralism here. I mean, well, because one thing that we forget, like I mean, like the Islamic conquests were like extremely successful and broad, and there was intense awareness of this and cultural exchange and so on. But we remember that. We don't remember the Byzantine Empire. Like, we don't remember Byzantium being this like hugely influential Christian empire that is not Roman Catholic. Although I don't want to exaggerate their differences there. So I just think there's so much awareness. Like, people know in the 13th, 14th century that like Constantinople was doing things differently and has different ways of thinking about various things. So yeah, anyway, I'm just repeating myself at this point. So
thank you for that, because I think I completely agree with you about people on the ground and not being a hive mind. These are all things that as a medievalist I beat all the time. But one thing that I think is very interesting, though, is the impact of elite thinkers' thought. Because one of the historiographical discussions among medievalists dealing with heresy right now, for example, you put your finger on the Cathar thing, not just were nobles Cathars, did Cathars before the Albigensian Crusades began actually even exist?
Yeah.
Was this even a heresy at all? And if it's not, if you choose to adopt that model, then what you're actually engaging with are the paranoid fantasies of people who got concerned about exactly the medieval form of the sort of thing you're interrogating here. And then they enforced it on the world around them in various ways when they found political actors whom it suited for other motives, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's precisely right. And, you know, when you think, and today, I mean, just the presence of religious pluralism is just so much at the forefront that, you know, when you actually push integralists on like how they would deal with it, you really get two kinds of responses. One is from the ones that are kind of like activists, and, you know, they just kind of say nasty stuff about, you know, well, Franco, Salazar, blah, 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 whatever. Or they're like what I call the theorists, like Pink or Crean and Vimister, and then they just back off to ideal theory, right? They just say, look, look, the ideal is very, very far away. You know, it's very, very different. We don't really know, probably wouldn't be a good idea to implement now. I've talked to Pink a great deal. I've talked to Father Crean a little bit. And I mean, Father Crean says, yeah, I mean, look, society has to be overwhelmingly Catholic for us to do this. And so the ideal is really far away. And so I think there's just like two-step, like if you want to be a practical integralist, pretty much got to be a totalitarian. And if you want to be just an ideal theory integralist, then you push the ideal so far away from modern conditions that I think we lose our grip on what we're even talking about. Because the underlying historical institutional circumstances would be so different that it's hard to imagine. So yeah, I think there's this dilemma, like to the extent that you want a concrete ideal, it's ugly. To the extent that you want a nice ideal, it's distant, even utopian.
So I think there's a question from Rinku Matthew that I'll read aloud.
Oh, hello.
So they ask, what's your views of Protestant integralism, such as the polity led by Zwingli? To elaborate, are the justifications Protestants to offer their religious states different from Catholic confessional states? If so, how?
Oh dear. Well, I mean, there's no two powers in the sense that there's no two polities. I mean, a huge thing that Luther's trying to do, and Calvin too, is that is to basically destroy like medieval canon laws, a separate system of law, of trying to put everything under the monarch. Partly this is, for Luther, a rearguard action. It's like, look, we got the kings on our side now, and so kind of build them up. He also has this, they also have this reading of Romans 13, which just makes them like super duper monarchical. Yeah, it's a really different picture in that sense. It doesn't look like baptism is playing a central role here at all, particularly once you start to get Protestants that are not doing infant baptisms. So yeah, the basis of it is a lot, sometimes will be like kind of Calvinists, like it'll be based on like some conception of restoring Old Testament law. Well, a certain branch of Calvinism, right? So you look at like Christian Reconstructionists or something, where you think, like this is just proper law, or sometimes, but it doesn't have this two powers. It doesn't have this two power structure. So it's pretty different than the Catholic view. The view that I have been getting interested in that is closer to the Catholic view, but still interestingly distinct, but I don't fully understand, is the Eastern Orthodox approach, which is the much more monarchical, but the monarch has various ecclesiastical functions. But the problem is a lot of the older Orthodox political thought is untranslated. So I just can't read it. The Protestant models, I think a lot of it is biblical, and it's not a two powers model in the same way either, where you have the supernatural sovereignty conditions. I've never even heard of a Protestant integralism where there'd be that kind of subordination of the state to the church, because the early Protestants, I think that just wasn't possible. Given the influence and power of the papacy to set up a bishop that would be more powerful than a king. I mean, you could barely do it outside of Latin Christendom, right? Because I mean, the Byzantine Empire didn't have these I won't call them dark ages, but the early Middle Ages, there was some institutional regression in certain numbers about longevity and so on. As I understand it, the East doesn't have this. And so you have a very powerful state, powerful emperor, but a lot of fighting between lots of different bishops. So you never get the kind of political decentralization, but ecclesiastical centralization that even made the integralist model possible. And by the time Protestantism is sort of out in the open, that arrangement is outside of Catholic countries is also no longer feasible. I just don't think you're going to get a Protestant king to, take direct legal orders from a bishop. I don't think that's how it worked, but I could be wrong very easily. I mean, but yeah, it's just from what I know, that would have been rare, or just given their theologies of monarchy and so on. But I'm open to be corrected.
So I'm going to stick myself on the queue at this point, and so one of the aspects of, I think one sort of important aspect of Mill's defense of liberalism is epistemic humility. Just how difficult it is to know anything in the matters of morality, politics, and religion. And I was wondering whether you thought that was important when you're evaluating integralism, or whether it makes the case against integralism stronger insofar as you have some kind of humility about what you can know about these matters, or whether you think the case for integralism becomes better if you think that you shouldn't be epistemically humble.
Yeah, it becomes weaker because one of the things integralism depends on is thinking that you can have a pretty detailed grip on what the common good requires. And, as I've said throughout, they think it's the normative master concept essentially. And so they think they can draw just conclusion after conclusion out of it. And if you're epistemically humble, there's two things that happen, I think. One is you realize the common good has components. You don't necessarily know the list. But the bigger problem is ranking members of the list of the goods that compose the common good. And plenty of natural law theorists understand this very well and make a very big deal out of it. that to the point where someone like John Finnis is famous for saying that the basic goods that comprise the common good are incommensurable. Like you can't even assign preference or indifference relations to them. And so our ability to know how to rank the goods is another problem. Now, I actually think it ends up getting the incommensurability is much stronger than you need, epistemic humility will get you a long way without making this strong metaphysical claim that I don't actually accept. So all you have to do is just say, yeah, I'm not saying the goods are incommensurable. I'm just saying, like, knowing which one's more important in one context is just really, really difficult. And so prioritizing supernatural good in this case, it might seem as a general matter we prioritize the supernatural good, but like there's lots of different, they comes in, as one philosopher puts it, he's like, supernatural goods comes in shapes and sizes, right? There's like going to the Eucharist receiving the Eucharist every day, right? Like suppose you can only go once a week, like how much of a loss is that, right? And suppose like, okay, you can trade, like if you had an integralist regime, more people would be going and receiving the Eucharist every day. On the other hand, there'd be some cost. Particularly,
I guess I was thinking
religious minorities would be severe.
I guess I was thinking there's partly there's epistemic humility in those kinds of questions, but I was also thinking you could have epistemic humility about like the truth of Catholicism itself, or whether or not the Pope is being divinely guided and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is actually a very interesting question because the integralist code, the coercion is a punishment, and the punishment presumes culpability. And if you're culpable, that is to presume that you either know better than to be a heretic, or that you should have known better than to be one, right? So there was some information that maybe you didn't have, but that if you'd done your duties of inquiry or whatever, you would have had, or something to that effect. And if you think that like reasoning about these matters is sufficiently difficult, then you might think what Catholics call invincible ignorance is just all over the place. And if invincible ignorance is all over the place, then you can't the integralist state can't do it much distinctively integralist, because it can't punish people because they're not. And so one of the things
I also was thinking, like, if I come along and just like decide that I'm going to punish Nevin today, and it turns out that he did something wrong, then like that's not a just punishment. It's not like in fact, I have to have a certain kind of epistemic standing with respect to whether or not Nevin has done something wrong.
Yes. So this is exactly where I was going next. So I was going to talk about heresy trials more in detail, but the canon law people were like, you're going to have to say more or less. So I just like to leave it a suggestion on a page, which is that determining culpability for heresy under modern conditions, I think would be a nightmare. Like, how do you judge that someone has defeaters for Lutheranism in a case? Like there's you've got modern criminal procedure, let's assume, right? So you have a lawyer, okay, right? You can appeal to all kinds of information and arguments. You can go all the way back to original systematic disputes and just say, look, there's no defeater here, or it's not an easily accessible defeater in a way that would generate culpability. Whereas like you knew that you were being reckless and someone got killed when you were drunk driving or whatever. That's a different kind of determination than that, like you knew better than to be Lutheran, right? Or you knew better than to be John Calvin, right? You might think, oh gosh, I mean, Calvin really tried to make all his beliefs consistent. Really worked at it. And so, to deem someone a heretic and to punishable heretic, they have to be culpable, and determining whether they're culpable involves determining whether they had easily accessible defeaters. And I just think under modern conditions, modern criminal procedure, you're not going to be able to know enough to make that determination. And so effectively heresy trials will just not occur. And punishments for heretics in general will just be unenforceable.
Cool. So sorry for the people still on the queue, but I think we're out of time. So everyone could join me in thanking Kevin for a fantastic.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. It's a weird project, so thank you for coming, especially so early. I'm very grateful.